Hi, good morning, everybody. This is Phishing Overboard. I'm Elise Manna. I'm Director of Threat Operations for Novacoast. So we are floating around out there in the sponsor booths. We do have an office in Manchester. We're based out of Santa Barbara, California. And the whole premise of where I started with this talk was to teach you everything I know about phishing and more than you probably ever wanted to. This really ended up becoming, how can all malicious links bypass security tools and all your malware sandboxes and make you pretty miserable with very minimal effort on part of the phishing criminals. The obligatory bio slide. I started out in a SOC. I worked for an anti-fraud company out of Charleston, South Carolina, where I dealt with thousands of phishing URLs a day at some points. I just had to cut my teeth really early. And it was just a very good exposure. I started learning about malware a little bit, and it was a great place to start. So for people that are looking to get into the security field, it's a really good way to get, some exposure to the different areas of security. I then moved over to being a malware analyst, and it pretty much ended up being a better title and dealing with more phishing. So it was spear phishing. You'd have different types of payloads, different types of URLs. It was a little bit more exciting, but for the most part, I was still doing a lot of email header analysis and those types of things. But again, you're always seeing those new types of attacks when you're in it every day, and you just develop almost alongside the criminals as they create a new technique, as they come out with something different, as they start abusing something old and becomes new again. You get to see it right on the forefront. Then I became a security engineer, and guess what? Still dealing with a lot of spear phishing. In this case, that was title. I was actually doing a lot of incident response, and I kept finding that my clients were dealing with these large-scale incidents. They were dealing with reportable breaches, and guess where they were starting? Malicious emails. So I really have never gotten away from it, and it's been interesting again to be able to just keep up with those techniques. Also frustrating because you see the same things working over and over again, and nobody seems to do anything about it. So it gives me a little bit of a reason to drink whiskey sometimes. I became a director. Now I just have meetings about phishing. I haven't really gotten away from it. If you can't tell, I'm from the States. I grew up in New York, so I'm trying very hard not to speak too quickly right now, so just wave me down if you can't understand a word coming out of my mouth. I now live here in sunny Santa Barbara, California. A lot different, no snow, it's fantastic. So the goals of this talk, ultimately, we're going to define phishing. I want to teach you how phish will evade detection. So that's really on your email gateway, anything that's looking at the user's inbox, anything that's trying to scrub that stuff coming in, the way that the most effective techniques that I'm still seeing that are going to evade detection and are going to go right into a user's mailbox. I also want to discuss some techniques for evading analysis. So once it gets into the hand of that security analyst, and they're testing it, they're putting it in a sandbox, they're putting it in their Kali VM, whatever it is, and maybe it looks offline, looks like it's okay, it's just going to google.com. How do you even know if there was something bad there or not? It's much easier to prove something's bad than prove something's good, and it's probably the most frustrating thing for an incident responder. I wanted to discuss how you can have a phishing campaign stay sticky. So, it's really for somebody that's more on the offensive side. How can you have essentially persistence of this type of attack? And how can you pull out the goodies in peace? So different ways that phishing criminals will pull out the information. I'm not going to dive too much into this because there's a handful of techniques. They're used over and over again, and again, they continue to work. Really, what I'd like you to get away from this is if you're a red team person, how is the best way, if you're on an engagement, to be able to get a phish through to user inboxes? If you're a blue teamer, how do you determine if something's actually an active phish or just benign? Is it spam? Is it not? If you're a security vendor, please stop allowing this crap into people's inboxes. And for users, for the love of God, stop clicking on phishing emails. Give me something else to do. Okay, so defining. From Google, this is the very long, verbose way of saying that it's pretending to be a legitimate company to steal information from you. For me, I'm defining this for the purposes of this talk as something that doesn't drop a malware payload traditionally, a computer virus. We're going to stick with kind of credential harvesters, but that doesn't really mean anything. I've actually seen fish that take a username password and they get really greedy and then they drop malware. So anything's possible. You can't just take something at face value. So the terminology does get a little wishy-washy here and there. So first, we're starting out with defense evasion. That's my tiny little disclaimer in the upper left. I am using live URLs in this demo. Some of them might be offline by this point now that the deck's been created over a couple of days, but they're not all sample URLs, so just be careful in case you're looking at one and you're curious and you're typing it in. Don't do it on a work device at the minimum. So the first technique I wanted to discuss was abusing the Microsoft Cloud. I've been seeing this a lot where you're seeing fish come on with like AzureWebsites.net or different variations of Microsoft-owned legitimate domains that are carrying fish on them. As I started looking more into this, because to me it was something actually I hadn't seen prior to maybe the last year, and as I was reviewing it, I was like, okay, well, Azure offers a 30-day trial. Of course that's going to be attractive. I'm going to have free hosting. It's going to have a reputation on the domain that's going to be fantastic. Nobody's going to detect this thing. And then I just move on to the next account after my 30 days. What I learned in my research is that this technique has worked since at least 2014, if not before that. That is way too long for a vendor to not know. Vendor, in this case, Microsoft. Sorry if anybody's in the room that works for them. That content stealing credentials is on their infrastructure that's pretending to be them. So Microsoft knows what their login page looks like. It knows what that HTML source code looks like, and yet these pages still continue to go up on their infrastructure and continue to steal login credentials for email. So this is kind of an example of it. That was an actual subdomain that was used. Sometimes there'll be variations of Office Mail or something that look a little bit more legitimate. This gets a little tricky if you're training users to hover over a link in their emails, which is often what security awareness training is teaching users to do. And they're going to say, oh, I know Azure. And they're going to click that thing. They're going to go to a page that looks like that. It's going to look exactly like their normal login page. And the attacker's happy because, again, they've got free hosting. They're not having to spin up a domain. They're not having to buy a domain from anything. They just have this stuff ready at their disposal. This is another example, and I know that's a little askew right there, abusing SharePoint. So again, how many organizations use SharePoint? Almost all of them at this point. So when you pop a SharePoint account or an Office 365 account from one organization, you use that SharePoint account to send fish to other organizations, maybe a business partner, provide some legitimacy to it. And it'll go ahead and provide a document that is maybe, this is a OneNote example, but it could be a Word document, Word Online, Excel Online. You could do anything that can hold a hyperlink. And it'll go past the filter because who blocks SharePoint.com in their email? Almost nobody. So this tends to be a very effective technique. The other piece is that a lot of scanning engines on the email gateways, they don't really go far enough to say, hey, there's a link here. Let me simulate a click and see where that goes and look at that reputation. They're looking at the reputation for SharePoint or that subdomain, and until an analyst or a researcher has marked that subdomain as compromised or potentially malicious, Virus Total and any threat intelligence feeds that are feeding phishing detection aren't going to see this. This is another one, and this is kind of might give you a laugh, but this is just an Office form. So in this case, your reputation's based on forms.office.com. If you use any Office forms in your organization and you don't have SSL inspection, you're not going to be able to really see that full URL in your firewall. So you can't block the full domain or that subdomain. So you have to allow all of your users to go to that fish if you can't scrub it at the email level. Now, Microsoft here, you can see there is a warning on the top saying, hey, we think this is asking for sensitive stuff. There's a warning at the bottom, never give out your password. Most users are not going to read that. They're going to just put it in. They're not thinking about it. They get a document. Maybe they're expecting a document or something to that effect. They'll put this in. This is not the best fish in the world. As you can see, your email is one string. It just says pass. In my opinion, there should be blocking in that realm that says if you have the string email and the string pass or password in this page, that you can't even upload this over to an Office Forms. You can't create an Office form with those terms. They do limit that you can't have password, but that's easily bypassed by truncating it, putting dots in between every character, putting spaces between every character, leaving a character off, changing one, doing leet speak, these types of things. Although those techniques will set off more alarm bells with more users if somebody's rushing, which they often are, they will sometimes still fall for these. So even though for the people in the room, it might look like garbage and how could anyone ever put this stuff in, think about Susie Q over in accounting, that probably will, and it's going to give you a better idea of how effective this can be. So similarly, Box, Dropbox, WeTransfer, any type of file transfer site suffer from the same fate. These can be locked down a little better by using web application whitelisting. So if you're only using Dropbox in your organization or only using SharePoint, then you can say, well, I don't want anyone going to www.box.com, and you just block it. And if it sees, your proxy see any traffic that looks like that, but most times that whitelisting is difficult, or most organizations have multiple file sharing services they use. They might have customers of theirs or business partners of theirs that require them to access things outside of what is used in-house. An example here, very similar to that OneNote example, you'll see here you have app.box.com. So if you have any legitimate Box stuff, how do you block that? You can't. You're going to have to do it by URL or have the URL flagged by some security tool. In this case, again, it's just a PDF. Most scanning engines aren't going to, and I say most because I'm just hedging my bets, it's all scanning engines, aren't going to see that a PDF has an embedded link, and it's likely not going to follow it to that phishing link there. Other ways to do this are abusing marketing services, so things like Mandrill, SendGrid, MailChimp that you've probably seen, HubSpot. I saw a Gartner one the other day, and then I couldn't find the sample for the slides, but that was a new one for me too. So Mandrilla is kind of nice because you can see the domain, at least in pieces, at the end of the URL, but some of these mask it completely with tokenization or some sort of encoding. So it will make it a little harder for the analyst to be able to determine, oh, is this bad or this good? Then you're forced to put it into some sort of tool or run curl on it, see where it goes. Is it redirecting? Where is it heading to? It does create just additional challenges, and it also can tie up your workflow, and it makes the analysis just last longer. I also wanted to touch on base tagging. So this is a pretty creative technique. I'm a big fan of this one, actually. So it'll have a tag in the body of the email that's just the base domain. It adds the rest of the URL as a separate piece. So when your scanning engine, it's looking for HTTP, in that case, it's only going to see example.com. It's never going to see this. It's never going to run anything against that full URL. It just doesn't concatenate it. It doesn't understand that type of split up. I'm using example.com in this part, but actually I've seen a lot of this using googleapis.com. So it'll be like Firebase storage dot or storage dot Google APIs. And then the rest of the URL just goes anywhere, and it'll go to a page, or it can go to a redirect and send you somewhere else. I'll go into multiple redirects a little bit later. So this creates that full URL. I am referencing that bleeping computer article because I took those screenshots right off their article, but the example is the same. So, you could do this combined with any of the other techniques. You could use this for a Box URL or a SharePoint URL, and the more techniques you add together, of course, the more effective your campaign is going to be. We also have seen quite a few with HTML encoding. This one kind of flummoxed the analyst I was working with because you see a lot of base 64. Most people can recognize that. It's got two equal signs on the end of it half the time, so it's easy to recognize. We were looking at this, and I was like, I know I can figure this one out, but I didn't know off the top of my head. It had been a while since I had seen it. This was actually an HTML attachment. So again, you're thinking, who would open the HTML attachment? Well, anyone that's ever received an encrypted email is going to open an HTML attachment because that's how a lot of those come through. So in this case, your scanning engine is just seeing a bunch of characters. It often won't know what's going on. Again, it doesn't even know that there's a full URL. It just sees that it stops and it has random characters. So there's very good likelihood that a user is going to be able to click this and visit through to that phish. It's also going to be very much harder to, search upon if you're doing anything from the endpoint standpoint. Same kind of applies with Base64. So this is a payload our pen test team actually wrote for me for testing a proxy tool. And I brought it to the provider and I said, hey, can you detect that? Do you know that that's a URL? How do you detect that somebody's on a web page to trigger that the proxy rules should be in effect? Is it traffic on port 80? Is it HTTP? Is it that, there's a DNS request somewhere? How do you even determine it? Or you're looking for HTTP in the address bar. Big surprise, I never got a response. If I ever get one, I can do a follow-up. But this is basically all the HTML source code needed for the page, and it's going to show like that to the user. They're going to think it's a long URL in some cases. You would hope they think that was suspicious because it definitely doesn't look like a website, but you never know. And then just another example was that where the Base64 is actually in the body of the page itself and not in the URL bar. This just makes it a little trickier for analysts. That's a pretty easy one to train on. So talking about Google. So this one is very effective, and you can see it's very simple to construct. So it doesn't require you to spin up any infrastructure as an attacker. You just use Google. You put the query parameter at the end of it, and you put your phishing URL at the end of it. Now, this one, reputation, because we keep coming back to that, right? A lot of scanning engines and email gateways are looking at the reputation of domain. If you're lucky, it's going to look at the full URL. How many things are going to flag www.google.com as malicious? Nothing. It's probably the most used website in the world. So this one gets past pretty much everything. This will also get past your user security training because they're going to hover over that and be like, oh, Google, click. There's nothing bad ever on Google. That's what they're going to think. They're going to go right to that site. This was another example. So I just redacted out the recipient's email address, but you can see that this actually had multiple URLs, URL encoded at the end of it, and then it was redirecting to another phish. And then this was randomizing the piece at the end of the URL too. So there were a lot of things going on with that one. Now, when I was testing this out for the slides, I was like, okay, well, I'm hoping Google does something about this. And I tested it out, and I always use LOL.com as my testing stuff. And it did bring me to a warning page, say, hey, there's a redirect thing going on. You might want to be aware. Do you really want to go to this site? I then was resetting the password on my Uber app as soon as I got to Manchester. It uses this in its actual password resets. There is no warning page. So it brought me right to the Uber accounts page via Google, and I never got a pop-up like this. So requires more testing on my part, to be frank. That was kind of a new discovery for me. I thought I was all prepared, and then that happened. So the other thing you can do is if that doesn't work or it is presenting that warning page and you're like, I don't want to have to deal with that because it's going to cut down my click rate by 50%, you can just put the malicious document on Google Docs or Google Drive. It works the same way as a SharePoint attack. So I wanted to go a little into anti-analysis. I'll try not to talk too fast while still getting through all my content. So geo-blocking, this one I just wanted to point out where it says the blocker.php. So a lot of times it's done as inclusion. I'll get into the rest of that code in a second. But a lot of times it's done through an htaccess file or a robots.txt file where it's going to deny the scanning engines for security companies. So when you are running this in ThreatGrid, if the ThreatGrid IP address is known to the attacker, all they do is block it, give a false 404 page. ThreatGrid's going to show you a 404 page, be like, there's nothing here. Risk score is 0. And you go about your day, and your user that's opening this from home gets right into it. Same thing works for user agent blocking. This one's kind of got some weird ones in it too, but you'll see like Message Labs is semantics, email URL rewrite. Security is another security company. So it's just trying to block, Fish Tank and all these things, and it just provides a false 404 page. This is another example. It's a little beefier, same concept. So other things, and this is, sorry for the defenders because now you're dealing with the red teamers in the room that are going to think of these things. Things like, hey, is the email address in the URL, does that match somebody that received it? So most analysts will change it to something like user@example.com. I like LOL at LOL.com. If I change that, I might get a 404 back. But if I use the actual recipient's email address, maybe the phish shows up. In that case, I've now doxed my recipient's email address. The attacker said, hey, this is valid, because they had to report it to me, right? So, that's something you traditionally don't want to do as an analyst. Something that dies after the first view. So once your victim has gone to it, you look at it, you think it's offline, you sit back on your laurels, that thing's still live. Tracking refers. So looking at multiple URLs that have gone and where it's coming from, making sure it comes from the lure email and it's going to the end phish. Or using iframes where the actual content hosted is not at the domain that you're looking at. So we kind of touched on fake 404s. You'll have benign redirects. So this is something where, hey, your IP address is coming from security company A, B, C, and it's going to just send you to google.com or send you to, Yahoo News or something to that effect. You look at it and you just don't think twice. You go on to the next thing. Everyone else from every other IP address can go to that phish. Sometimes they'll redirect to PDFs that are just found out on the internet, so the user thinks nothing of what's going on. They were expecting a PDF, and they put their creds in to get a PDF. They get a PDF. It'll just be a random one. I won't get too far into this because this is kind of a lengthy topic, but wildcard DNS creates challenges for blocking on your firewall. So if you're just blocking, example.com, or you get one phishing URL and say you get that first one, it could be that everybody that visits it from the embedded link in the email, they get a different subdomain every time. This can be very tricky to block if the example.com, in this case, is a site that your company is actually using. So layered redirects, I just grabbed this PayPal phish right off a fish tank, and I used some really random URL shorteners, but to give you an idea here, a lot of scanning engines might get to like this piece, but they won't get all the way down there. So that's another challenge to be faced. This screenshot's from wheregoes.com. It's one of my favorite tools. It's just so much faster than using curl or wget and having to do everything. Just use a web tool, throw it in there, see what the end target is. So directory generators, this is the one that's visiting us again. Basically all this code is on the bottom in this PHP file is saying every time that this is visited, so it's usually an index.php, that's the link in the phishing email, go ahead, take a copy of all my phishing files, create a new directory with a random MD5 hash, copy all those files in there, and then have the person go to that. What happens is you end up with a very full compromised web server because every time somebody clicks it, there's a new directory with a whole new set of phishing files. I may or may not have heard of people just filling up the resource limit on a web server by just hitting that page over and over again. But essentially that's what that's doing. It becomes very difficult again from a blocking and analysis perspective. So other things that can be done is hiding your files in multiple places. So a phisher might pop a web server or somebody's site, and they'll put a copy in WP includes, the admin removes it, and there's still a copy in WP content. Maybe they change the redirect to point to the one that's live, something to that effect. Using a backdoor web shell, they can go in, and every time you remove the file, they're going to put it right back up. Or doing forwarding rules. This is kind of the best example of persistence in phishing, I would say. So they can intercept a password reset email. They can intercept everything that person's getting. So the person calls the help desk, hey, I need to reset my password. It's completed. They're still getting every email from that inbox without even having to log in. So you'll see this a lot after the email address is popped. They'll add their own email address as a forward. And so, if you're investigating these, check the inbox rules. And this is really where you're taking the stuff out. So oftentimes it's pulling things to an email account. So it'll be a PHP file that's part of the phish. there's a post that goes to it and just sends out, it'll kind of build out the email. Usually there's falsified header information, and it'll use that compromised web server to send things out. Storing text files on there, and then they'll go back and either just pull down the text file if it's open internet accessible, or they can use a PHP or web shell backdoor to do this. Where this is cool if you're an analyst is sometimes you can actually grab that text file. So if you can grab it before they clear it, before an attacker clears it, you can have a full list of people that have fallen for that phish, including those that are part of your organization and everybody else. And you can kind of go through that, and it helps with the remediation process. Is that a 2 or a 1 or over? Okay. I already kind of covered the forwarding rules anyway. So that's my last reminder, is that the average time it takes for a phisher, even a not sophisticated phisher, about 15 minutes to get back into an account and then abuse an account for whatever their end purpose is, whether it's sending more payloads out or stealing information from that inbox. So knowing that these things can happen, speed up the analysis process and allow you to be able to remediate the situation much faster. I guess we get 30 seconds for questions. I got through it all. Sure.
Just quickly, so on my company I work for, they have a thing in Outlook, Safe Links. So Microsoft supposedly scans whatever links are in your email. The annoying thing for me as a user is that the link that's in my email, when I hover over it, it just says Microsoft Safe Links, and it doesn't tell me anywhere about where it's going to.
Right.
Now, what's your opinion on that? Like, obviously, how much do you trust Microsoft to correctly identify a phish link?
Specifically Microsoft?
Oh, just like, how would you, any system like that?
Not at all, to be frank. And that isn't actually Microsoft specific. So URL rewrite creates more challenges from the user training perspective because of exactly what you're explaining. And because it's not catching 100%, because no tool is going to catch 100% of phish, you lose all that ability for the user to defend themselves without gaining full protection on the other side of it. So it's good from a metric perspective that sometimes those will tell you when you're doing the investigation that you had 30 people click it without you having to go through your SEM or your firewall logs. To that effect, it can be advantageous. But, for the most part, I don't find those protection tools to be very effective. And I'm a big fan of user education and training. Again, nothing's going to be 100%, but I think that they're the first layer of defense. So anything you can give them that's a weapon versus relying on the tool to do the job is better, in my opinion. Anybody else? Sure.
Have you seen campaigns on Office 365 where the attacker is able to reply the two-factor authentication code?
I have not faced it, but I am familiar. So I've seen that with SMS being the two-factor. I've heard of it being done with other attacks, but I haven't seen it in the wild myself. So.
Evil Jinx too.
There we go. I know I've read the article on it, but I haven't caught one myself. I'm waiting on it.
Turn off pop and you're fine.
There we go. There's the solution. So, and you should probably have that off anyway. IMAP and POP. Nothing really good ever comes from that. So, unless somebody's using Thunderbird to access their email, most enterprises probably should have that off. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you.